It is time for us to begin this morning, and so if you would like, you can open your Bibles to somewhere in 1 Peter, because we're going to be everywhere in 1 Peter this morning. And so hopefully we'll have that ready for us as we kind of look at the overall text as a complete letter, rather than how we often are kind of digging for nuggets of gold in the soil of the message. And so we'll do that in just a moment. Before we do that, though, if you would bow with me in prayer, we'll begin our class after that. Heavenly Father, we thank you today for the blessings that we find in Jesus. We thank you for the relationships that we share in the kingdom, and it's our hope as learners and disciples that we grow our faith today. Challenge us to become more like your Son. Support us in our journey and forgive us of our sins. And we offer this prayer in his name. Amen. All right, so we kind of looked at the last four verses as how Peter closes his letter. And he's got a little bit of a summary in there because, like most of us, when you end up at the close of a written thing, you kind of seal it back all together. Much in the same way as we introduce those things together. But we're going to back up a couple of steps in our process this morning and kind of think about the letter as an entire thing. All the bits and pieces that would be included in it. All the things we think are important. How this particular letter fits into the entire body of the New Testament and where that affects our faith. So let's start doing it this way. Right now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about the very first specific verse from 1 Peter that comes to mind. Like if you can identify the chapter and number and maybe give a quote or a sense of that verse. Like if you say, hey, what's this verse mean, or what is the exact wording? So think about that. Don't answer the question yet what that is, but I want you to think about that for a second. Now, before I begin asking questions about that, ask yourself why that particular verse or idea. Why is that what comes to mind first? The reason I ask that without you guys asking is I don't want each of us to cloud our answer to the question with everybody else's answer, because we're very easily kind of like, oh, that's really cool. Like, oh, that's a good verse too. That really is important, and I see why that's valuable to you. So the first step on our journey to kind of summarize this is to think about the most noteworthy verse to you. That's first step one. So think about that, get that in your head. Now you've got to think, why do I think that one's the one? What made that one be important to me? Now, this is the last step before we start talking about our answers in our heads. Again, if someone came to you and said, hey, I was just reading my Bible, and I got to the point where I'm just reading it through, and 1 Peter is the next book I'm going to be reading. What's 1 Peter all about? That's like the next question. Before you start talking out loud, what would you say to that question? Like, hey, what's this all about? So we have three questions on the table. Your most notable, impactful verse, why that verse came to your head, like why that one for you, and what do you think this book is all about? If someone came and said, I'm reading my Bible, I just got to 1 Peter, that's my next book to read. What is this about? What should I prepare for? All right, so those are all in your head now. And they're not very far apart, so we should be able to hold them all at the same time. How many of you have 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21 as your first verse? I do. You're like, now, how many of you have something else? That should be everybody else, right? So before I give my reasons for why that verse came to mind, I want to hear the ones that aren't mine. So if 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21 isn't the first verse that came to mind for you, what was it? What's your other verse? Michael, you had your hand up.
Yeah, two always stick in my head. And one is I need to be aware that Satan is seeking to devour me like a lion. That always jumps out in my head because I think sometimes I let that slip and I don't realize how constantly he wants to destroy me. The other verse that jumps out is be hospitable to one another without complaint. And maybe it's just because I love that verse says without complaint, because I realize when we are hospitable to one another, there's actually a lot of work involved. Whether you're having 2 people you're being hospitable to, 1 person, or 20 people. And we're to do that without complaint. We want to do it. It's fun to do it, but it's easy to complain about because it is work.
You know what's super interesting? Google just releases every year like surveys of like written text because they read everything on the internet. The internet does that. The number one thing that people write about on the internet is a complaint. The largest portion of what is written, and if I say on the internet, that's basically everywhere at this point because everything you write in print eventually trickles into digital spaces. So the most common form of communication in the English-speaking world is a complaint. So when God says do this without complaint, my mind goes, okay, there's a challenge right there. Because our behavior as humanity is in line with God's teaching as a disciple. And never think that you're above humanity's pull. Like the world is going to pull you down with it every ounce it can get. So now I have a little bit of a charge. I got to stop complaining as much and start praising more. What else? What are some of the other non-first Peter chapter 3 verse 21 folks and why? Shirley, did you raise your hand for not having that one as your first verse?
1, 15, and 16, it says, be ye holy, because I am holy. It's kind of like my North Star, that's why I like it.
Yeah, that's a great tie-in to the Old Testament text of Leviticus, where God calls up his people to holy behavior in concert with his, and then we who are grafted into the body of Christ, or rooted into that, are expected to kind of join the family behavior, be like God, as Israel was supposed to be like God. What else? Who else didn't have it that I missed? Donna?
I have 1 Peter 4, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you.
Why do you think that's your verse?
I just hope to God I get to heaven.
Yeah, it's a super forward looking. I'm looking for the future, which is part of the core message of this book. This is a very future forward, post-suffering perspective. What else? Anyone else want to offer or give? Cecilia?
Well, Michael took mine.
You could have a different reason for it.
No, well, the one above it, though, is casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you.
Yeah.
We sometimes get, what you said about internet, is always complaining. We get bogged down in the day-to-day
Yeah.
life, and it's always nice to know that he'll take our burden away from us.
Yeah, it's a powerful part of that relationship. Matthew chapter 10, verses 11 through 20 has a lot about this. The few other passages in the New Testament that really hone in on the things that you complain about. Most of them actually are things that God can take off the table for you.
Well, what's nice about this is he's not going to take them away from us unless we ask him.
Yeah. Rich, did you have something?
Maybe.
Okay, it counts. It's a correct answer if it's the answer you believe.
Chapter 3, verse 7.
Okay.
Chapter 3, verse 7. So it's important to have that relationship with your wife. That's obviously understanding because we don't think the same, and sometimes they are complementary and we don't know it. But the other part of that is that if I don't do that, my prayers are or could be hindered or will be hindered.
Yeah.
So that's important. So that marriage relationship is key.
Yeah, the linchpin of relationship that we take those passages, that one and the passage that Paul talks about behaviorally in the Timothy letters, and we kind of scrape them off that space and make them about somebody else. Or like, well, you have to dress this way, you have to think this way, you have to act this way, when they're actually relational passages that say, when we behave this way, we are stronger together and we are in a connection with God in a healthier way, and my prayers are going to be actually more effective and successful. And that's, I think, is a super valuable part of this bigger picture of the book. Because you think about what's going on in their life to make Peter need to say that. Like, you know, in the midst of their context, this is something they need to hear. All right, now let's talk about my answer to the question, in which some of you also shared. So 1 Peter 3, verse 21. How many of you want to talk about why you think you have that as your answer? Les, I know you gave that as your first verse. I wonder if your answer is my answer, so let's see what you got.
Well, because in the area that we live in here in the South, there's such prominent doctrines that don't believe baptism is necessary. That's a prominent verse that used along with others to show the purpose of baptism.
Yeah, like it makes the faith that we share iconic. By holding on to the concept from the scriptures that your baptism, and we sometimes say essential, but I like to also include rooted in genuine faith. And when you pull that chunk of it out, you're pulling the roots of your faith out, and your faith won't last because it's just a belief rather than something you actually moved to do and confess. It's a powerful thing. And I know why I have that there. There's two reasons that I came right to my head. Number one, as a new convert, it was on the first list of passages that I was expected to memorize. I was a college kid, and our Bible class teacher, we have adults in that class, it was all adults in there. He's like, all right, we're reading Hebrews today, and that was the beginning of the class. It was a Hebrews class. But here's your list of verses to memorize for next week. And I'm like, I was the youngest kid in that class. Everyone else was in their 50s and 60s, a bunch of old folks. They wouldn't let me in the college kid class for some reason. I knew why. That they wanted to be supervised. It was for my own good. And they wanted to build relationships with me. But they expect all of us to memorize these passages. Some of them already knew them. There were a couple other older new converts in the class with us. Some longtime members. We all memorized those passages together. And so that's one of the very first scriptures that I memorized. That's reason number one. Reason number two for me is I, like Les kind of hints at, practically I use it. I use it often in conversation with folks because it's a regular subject that comes up as a question. Hey, are you guys the folks who think baptism is like, if you're not baptized, you're going to hell? I'm like, well, I don't really say it that way, but I understand why you would feel that. And I think there's people who have been baptized who really have lost their salvation too. I don't think baptism is some magic shield. I said it's like the center point of your transformation. And if you want to be transformed, you will be baptized. And if you don't want to be transformed, let's talk about it. And so that's kind of how my brain arrived at that concept of, ooh, this is the verse that remembers, because I use it a lot. Practitioner. That's like something I say in conversation, in teaching, often. And that's how our brains work, right? If we say or do something a lot, it becomes no longer a conscious thought. We talk about being a subconscious activity. Because I'll do it this way. Everybody hold your breath. Actually hold your breath. Don't pretend to hold your breath. Now start breathing again. How many of you are having to tell yourself to breathe? And like control the process. But eventually, if you start doing other stuff, what happens to your body? What takes over the system? Everything else in your body that makes you breathe on a regular basis, right? Because it's subconscious. It's part of our physiology, but it's a physiological thing that we can control. A neat thing to recognize then is that in a lot of our life, that's exactly how we are. The more we train ourselves to think and move a certain way, the more likely we are to do that before we even think about it. And I think there's something rooted in the big, space of this text that also does that a little bit too. All right. Third question we asked to begin with as we kind of summarize the book together. Your answer to what you think 1 Peter is about if somebody asked you. And these answers are probably going to be a little bit different, right? This is something that might connect to why we had a verse as our big verse thing. Well, what would your answer to be to that? If someone said, hey, what's 1 Peter about? Like, why does God need me to know this? It's kind of half of that question. So what might your answer to that question be? You can raise your hand or start talking. Those are both equivalent outcomes. Donna?
What Mike says all the time, our hope for our salvation in heaven. Hope for a home in heaven.
Yeah, like that's a big part of the destination of the text, like where you're going to get. What else? What are some other ways to think about it? Rich?
So Peter's, when you look at the audience he's speaking to, there's going to be suffering because of your newfound relationship with Christ. And through all of the various things that happen through life, keep your eye on the prize, which is the rewards at the end. So part of it is keeping that mind on the spiritual rewards that are offered, and sometimes that's hard to do.
Yeah. What other approaches or thoughts, if you're explaining it to that first-time reader, reading their Bible? Got any other options? We've covered a couple of really good ways to think about it. Let me suggest something that I think is a way to think about it. 1 Peter is almost unique in this idea, in that of the epistles, it takes that idea of being rooted in the past in a different direction. You have a Hebrew author, Peter himself is rooted in his Israelite background, to a Hebrew people to talk about what's happening to them when they're no longer Hebrews. Like that, there's a huge thing going on there. But he does so in a way that does not miss the reality that they still have all of the roots of their experiences in that shared history. So they don't stop being ethnic or cultural Jews. But their home is no longer in Jerusalem. Nor is it where they're living. Their home is now truly heavenly. And so it's a letter that talks about how to endure suffering victoriously. Or, as we talked about last week, with glory. The glory that was found in Christ is going to be replicated in our transformation, and we too will be glorified in the resurrection. And that means different things to different people. If you see someone who is obviously pregnant, 7 months along, and you know that they're with child, some of the times people will see that person and say to them, "You look like you're glowing." Right? You ever seen someone do that before because they look that way? What's going on there? Why do we see them in that regard? Physiologically and socially, why do we use that terminology? Has their body changed? The answer is better be yes, like their body has changed, right? And I'll tell you why it doesn't feel this way, I'm told. That your body's changed for the better. Like, wait a minute. How is it for the better? Because it's not just you anymore, right? You are encapsulating another human being. And so when you see someone who's with child, you look at them and go, there's two. There's something about to be apparent beyond that. There's part of it's that. But also, I suspect, because this comes up in thinking about humanity from garden to now, we use that terminology because literally it looks, because of their countenance, their attitude, they're carrying themselves a little bit differently, besides the physiological fact of how childbirth functions and all that stuff. They're anticipating something. They're actually kind of mostly excited for something, and everyone around them is too. I suspect that glory to a degree can be thought about that way. That's one level of expectation. That same attitude that we surround a young woman with as they are expecting child. But there's another one in the scriptures too. And that's one's talked about in the Bible. That's something that comes up quite a bit in concept, this idea of childbirth and redemption. But think about the transfiguration. When, for a moment, a greater level of Christ's glory is shown to the disciples in concert with the patriarchs. How do you guys visualize that moment? Because all of us have tried to figure it out, right? You got a way, you got an image of it in your mind. So picture that in your mind. Realize that people, human beings were there that God inspired to write this record of. And so they gave this image of his glory was displayed. So, if someone asked you this question, and I'm asking it to you, what does God's glory look like? Got an answer to that question? It's not an easy one to answer, by the way. Don't feel like it's
Light.
Light is one of the answers, because it's not darkness. That image is associated with rebellion, death, and decay. What else? What else might come to mind? Power is a big thing to God's glory, but not power without conscience or ethics. It's not raw, unbridled, unchambered power, but it is definitely power. Because you get too close to God's glory, what happens? You'll die. But that leads us to the next question. So light is an excellent first answer. Power is a component. But why do we die when we get too close to the light? In this case, powerful light. Why would we die? What does the Bible tell us in that sense?
God is holy.
Oh, God's holy. That kind of matches our message of the text, that the holiness of God, in concert to our lack of holiness, or unholiness if you want to get simpler, cannot exist in the presence of that powerful light. We die. So glory that we're being transformed towards is going to change us in a way that we can be near something that hasn't and will not change. So our transformation is going to make us more like God in that regard, however that means. Because remember, that transformation is not exactly spelled out. It's, you'll be like this. This is kind of what it's like. Here's a picture of what it is similar to. So that transformed state found in the matured disciple, and I say matured not in the sense that they're stronger in faith than others, and matured in the sense they've completed their course. They've been planted as a seed, and now they've been reborn, and they're the new plant that God has built in them. That's someone who can be in the presence of God, who can be in the presence of heaven and not die. So I'll suggest to someone who's reading it, there's a lot of topics. There's some moral issues that are discussed. There's some challenges of specific suffering solutions, but it's still moving from a people who have been rooted in the physical nature of their faith, Israel, very touch, feel, taste, to the spiritual outcome of their faith, heaven and glory. And we've got to do a good job then as disciples of practicing that message, of practicing a message that calls us in that regard, that ties together all kinds of big pictures, all the private interpretations of the parables, his big preaching, all kind of get smooshed together in some of the small dialogues of 1 Peter. So I would probably try to figure out a way to say that shorter. I wouldn't use 10 minutes to tell somebody something I probably could phrase in 1 minute. That then moves forward with us thinking about the more detailed context sections. And so we've got our primary idea that we thought about. Okay, my first top of the head verse, and why that's important to me. Now we've got a couple of different ideas in regards to how I would give a summary or a synopsis of what's in there. Similar to your chapter headings. Remember all those chapter headings that are not uniquely tied to the verses. Those are suggested content ideas. And chapters themselves are added. Original letters, just like our letters, just go from first part of the page to the end of the page. And so chapter 15 and chapter 16 are roadmaps, not state lines. And so you got to kind of remind yourself of that. But this is kind of what kind of topics are found to accomplish these things. Does this list of content cause you to shift your idea of the synopsis of what we think it's about to what it might be about? Michael, you're shaking your head yes. How does this shift your content?
When somebody asks me, what is it about? The first thing that pops into my head is a lot.
Yeah.
It covers a lot of stuff. It's hard to narrow it down to a one sentence answer.
Yeah, and that's the challenge of anybody's writing. If you write a letter to someone you care about, how many of us write about one thing and then mail it off? I'm writing a letter. I'm going to tell you about everything. Everything's been going on since the last time I talked to you. And I'm going to try to guess what will be important to you in the future. And if it's family, then it's almost always me reminding both of us, hey, we got this thing coming up. Looking forward to seeing you at. Like the next time we're going to get together. By the way, Paul does that sometimes too in the end of his letters. Can't wait to see you. Translates to, I am trying everything I can to get to Rome or up to Corinth. It's the same concept. I want to see you again. I want to be near you. I want to share in first-person experiences. So we've got hope, like we talked about. We've got lifestyle things about be holy as I am holy. We've got what roots people in their faith. That was my big thing. Like we're rooted in our past as Hebrews. And by the way, we have been grafted in. We are adopted Hebrews in that sense. And so our adoption kind of puts us into the family line. Remember, think about it this way. How many of you in your recipe books have a recipe that is known not by what the food is, but by the name of the person associated with that recipe? So we have in our family Mary Louise casserole. And it was Mary Louise McCuistion's recipe for casserole, but it's Mary Louise casserole. It's almost Hamburger Helper, all right? Like it's similar. It's like elbow noodles with meat and cheese, like that's what it is. But it's Mary Louise casserole. And if you say it in our family, of which I'm adopted into in this regard, because I'm married into the family that has the recipe, everybody knows, right? But if I had not told you kind of what it was, and I said, hey, you want some Mary Louise casserole? You'd be like, what you talking about? I mean, I probably do, because it's probably not bad, because you're offering it to me, and it should be okay. But I may not be able to eat what's in that. I might be intolerant of it. Well, when you're adopted into a family, you take on all the family attributes. Remember that when you think about who you are as a disciple. You're adopted into the family of God. You're grafted into the root of Israel. You never kept the law, but you're part of the family of God's people that goes before the law, through the law, and to Christ. And if you've got a better recipe, that's a family recipe that you can share, you can go ahead and send it to me. I'll take that recipe too. And I'll give it the appropriate titling and name, because I want all the good recipes in my life. And if you love it, I probably love it too. And if you knew the Mary Louise recipe, it's probably from the Northwest. That's probably where it lives the most. So think about that now as we think about what else is in here. Submission and good conduct. How we respond to persecution. Exhortation to elders. The message shifted, right? It shifted from rooted in who you are and what you're doing to kind of practical stuff. You ever read a letter from someone and a message and it starts off with, "You're doing so great. We talk about how good you're doing. You know, last week you did this great project. 2 months ago, man, you were really doing great in this training we were in. You know, and you really relate well to your family or your coworkers. Oh, and by the way, I really want to talk to you about." You ever got a letter like that, or an email, or a phone call? It's a behavior thing, right? We tell them all the good stuff first to lower the pressure level of the conversation. And then we say, okay, now we've got to really work on something. I was reading a little note from some friends of mine who work in the corporate world. And in their corporate space, meetings show up on their calendar unannounced. And you can have a meeting with the boss, the big boss, or that boss's boss, and the secretary just says you're going to be there. Well, they learned in that corporate context that they need to actually spell out what those meetings are at, rather than just saying, "You're meeting with the head of the department tomorrow." Especially in times when the business might be seeming like it's downturning. And so you get that show up and you're thinking am I being fired? Am I out? Like, what did I do? And so they actually now spell out why you're meeting. Usually it's, hey, we're just going to touch bases, talk about this new project, and they really spell out what's going on so people don't come to the meeting going, well, I guess I'm being fired today. Well, to a certain degree, there's a little tender kind of tint of this in this letter where he shifts from building a foundation of their shared relationship and commitment together in the family of God to admonitions. Or you can think about it in the way in which we do a sermon. We give you 3 points, and then we make an application at the end and invite you to do it. So at the end of this letter, there's these things that, hey, if you do these things, you will be better off. If you think in this way, you will be better off. Whether it's the relationships that are closest to you in your marriage, whether it's how you think about the pressure that's on you. Because the text of 1 Peter 3, verse 21 that I use practically and informationally actually isn't initially about the thing that I use it for. Because it's actually a reminder to those who have already been baptized. It's not a text written explicitly to those who haven't. Because these are all believers. These are all Christians. So they're being reminded of it, not taught it for the first time. And so they're reminded of it in order to more successfully survive their persecution. And to all, then there's some exhortation. You ever see someone cheering loudly for someone who seems to be losing every ounce of their ability to go forward? You ever been at the end of a cross-country race and watched cross-country runners complete a 5-mile race? It's unfathomable to me to want to run that far. I have never desired, I've run that far. I've never wanted to run that far. And this is the little key reminder. If you see me running, that means I'm running to something that you want to see or away from something that you don't want to be around. And so there's no middle ground. I will never be running to run, period. But you get folks at the end of a cross-country race, and they're finishing those races, and their breathing and everything is starting to give out. They're slowly about to melt into the ground, and you cheer wildly for them in the hopes that, hey, they'll run a little faster, a little harder, and that last 100 and pass one person and improve their point status for the entire team to perform better. Much like the Hebrew writer talks about in his letter. So these exhortations are not equivalent to the censure or admonition of Revelation 2 and 3. where it's not this, hey, you're doing so horribly, you better fix it or your candle is going to be removed. These closing statements are much more about you need to be cheered because you will be cheering others. And that kind of shifts the way you read it a little bit too. Because he doesn't close it with like, hey, you better repent or God is coming quickly. It's, hey, you should do this because it's effective for you and for others. Let me check my clock here. All right, we got 10 minutes. We're actually on schedule, so that's good. All right, so that's kind of that big picture of things, of stuff that's in there, and it may shift the way in which you understand the big picture message of the book. Like, what's the most important thing? Because there's a lot in it. Like Michael pointed out, there's like a whole bunch of subjects. There's all these different topics, different things of importance. So now comes the neat part of the text. I want you to think about and maybe come up with for yourself a new verse to memorize. So it can't be one of your chosen verses. It could be someone else's. And I'm not going to test you on it. This is not a high school class. It's not a college class. We're not going to have quizzes. But my suggestion to you is find a verse, maybe two if you want to do that. Put it on a 3x5 card or a sticky note. Put it in your bathroom, your mirror, when you're getting ready in the morning. Works really well. Put it if you got sticky notes at work, slap it on the side of your monitor. Trey, I don't know about slapping it on the dash of the airplane. I don't know if you can do that or not. So you have to find a different solution to this problem. I'm not sure I want sticky notes in the cockpit of the flights that I'm on because they might block something you need to see. Maybe there's a spot for it. I don't know. But figure that out and add a new verse to your vocabulary. And you may pick one that matches how your shift of what you think the book is about. Because if it's shifted for you and you've kind of had a moment where, hey, this is actually about more than maybe I first thought, then memorizing a passage that connects that idea might help you make it a subconscious thought. It might shift it from choosing to breathe versus breathing without choice. And so if you can kind of put that into you and kind of think about it a little bit and process it, that's what I intend to do. And I'm going to do that for me. I'm going to slap it on my sticky notes. It's going to come up in my little notifications on my computer and say, hey, read this verse again, memorize it. And I'm actually challenging myself to memorize it in a different translation than my native translations, the ones I'm most comfortable to. Because I want the idea as much as I want the exact verbiage. I want to get the concept to stick in my head. All right, so that's like the homework from the class. You got homework. Oh, homework's not bad. This is good homework. But now we have our survey of the big picture. These are familiar questions, right? But I want to shift our questions at the close of these segments in a little bit different way. And not only ask, what did I like or dislike, but also make sure we think about why. It's one thing to know, I didn't like this. How many of you like broccoli, asparagus, or a similar dense leafy vegetable? Like vegetables, we are friends, right? I'm all about them. All of them. I have regularly realized that for the most part, there's not a vegetable that I won't eat. All right? But that's different from saying, well, why? I like vegetables. Why do I like vegetables? Slightly different question. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And I can tell you why I don't like certain types of fruit, citrus in particular. I like its flavor, not its texture. So I have a reason. Don't like the texture of citrus. Even though, by the way, think about this, it's not that much different than vegetables. May not make sense, but that's why, right? So, what did you like in 1 Peter? We've answered that question, right? You like the things that are most important to you. And we answer part of the why. Now we get to a new what, where we can think about why. what does this text teach us about God? Michael?
When we get near the end, it says, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. It's easy to think, I need to hold the world up. It's easy to think, this problem's not going to be solved if I don't fix it. Sometimes I think way too much of myself when it comes to solving a problem.
Yeah, that's a universal story of man, right? But that brings us to why God gave us this text, or why do we think this aspect of things is important. Our whys creates a nice little rooting space, a plant livelihood space underneath our what that give us a bunch of great knowledge points. Why did God have Peter write this? Well, he needed it. These people needed these things. Why did it impact me this way? Well, much like my vegetable fruit metric, such is the same thing for why a message of God's word impacts me a different way. Well, it challenged me because I don't like this. You want to see me challenged? Give me a grapefruit. I will finish the grapefruit if you tell me I needed to eat it. It will look exactly as you imagine it might be in the process of me struggling to complete the eating of said grapefruit, right? Okay, so that's how we are spiritually too. Oh, this doesn't taste good. Oh, this is not good. Like, you give me something I don't want to eat, I don't want to digest, I don't want to take a bite of. It's good for me, uniformly is, but I don't like it. And so sometimes that's why we don't like a realization of the text. Bobby?
In 1 Peter 1, verse 22, he says, see that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. Well, at times that can be hard to do because it might be the way you have been treated in the past by someone.
You think about that in incremental steps. To love someone, and you're admonished to love them well, fervently, in effort, and like desire and zeal. The challenge goes on two sides of the table. Our challenge that Bobby's identifying pretty clearly is sometimes we're the problem that's stopping us from loving like we should. Because we haven't forgiven, we've been hurt, problems are not fully resolved, sin still exists between us and them, and we're bitter. Maybe we're also cold because the fire of the relationship has gone out. Their end of the table matters too. They may not want to be around us. They may engage in behavior that makes it hard to love them. They do things that we don't want them to do. They say things that hurt. My biggest experience is on a personal level, is my mom, in about the third phase of her Alzheimer's, said stuff that didn't make any sense to me. And it was hurtful. But I had to remember to myself, the time that she is in her head may not be now. And what she sees around her, I can't see. You know, like literally the way the brain kind of functions in that middle to late stage Alzheimer's is they live in different worlds. So I had to remember that it was my job to go into her world, not bring her into mine. And help her figure out why she was upset, why she was mad at me, even though she didn't know who I was. Because she wasn't mad at me, she was mad at someone 20 years ago. Or she could have been mad at me when I was little. Like, those are also options on the table. Fair kind of ways. And you have to think about that. Sometimes that's what's going on because of sin or because of a broken relationship. And that kind of helps us better appreciate what God needs us to know from a very substantial or dense section of just words. Every part of the Bible, even those that we think are easy to understand, are not that. They're all relatively the same reading level, the same language level. Some of them require us to be able to have a little bit of background. but we will digest them over years, and the meal that was once an appetizer becomes the main course. And then that meal also becomes dessert. Because we have changed, and you could say maybe our taste buds have changed, they become more refined. And we hopefully have gotten a better appreciation of God's things. That's it for class this week. We will be looking at 2 Peter next week, and if you want to read this week, read through the whole book, because we're going to look at the whole book to introduce the upcoming smaller segment.